Welcome to Cooking the Books. I'm Frances Cook. If you've paid even the slightest attention to the news lately, you'll know house prices have spiraled up past even the most optimistic expectations. It's led to intense bidding wars, buyers offering tens of thousands above asking price just to secure their spot, banks reporting backlogs of mortgage applications. Frankly, it's a housing feeding frenzy. Now, while house prices are something that make people feel rich if they already own a place, I do feel for the frustrated first home buyers who struggle to keep up with this flurry of activity. Another issue is that when there's this level of emotive buying in a market, it tweaks my spidey senses. Emotions and money are a bad combination and can lead to bad outcomes in the end. So, how can you make sense of what's going on and what's likely to happen next?
News Talk ZB presents Cooking the Books with Frances Cook.
I'm joined now by independent economist Tony Alexander. Now, we're hearing a lot about panic buying, FOMO, the housing market running super hot at the moment. What do you think is happening to stoke house prices to such an extent right now?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. If we go back, I guess, to the earliest days when we came out of lockdown, there was a flood, not of investors into the market, but the first home buyers, first of all. They were hoping that listings would be available. They had money available, built up from 7 weeks of saving, money available because they couldn't travel overseas and spend, $20,000 there. And of course, the LVRs had been removed and the interest rates were a little bit lower. So the first home buyers jumped into the market. Some investors, they also entered the market and they were hoping for bargains. I've got a survey I do each month with REINZ that tells me they were hoping there'd be some bargains early on. Well, those hopes are pretty much out the window now. But that sort of got the ball rolling. And maybe it was around about, I'm thinking July, August, at the latest September, that it was pretty obvious to everybody the market was completely different from what was expected, that house prices were rising. And so those people who'd stood back, they started jumping into the market. And also, I think, and this is, I guess, the key one, why we've seen the market become so strong and FOMO develop out of that. People have looked at the fact that, okay, there's $200 billion worth of savings that New Zealanders have in their bank deposits there, earning, if you're lucky, 0.8% when you come up for a renewal now. And so people are thinking, well, I can go and buy a property and look how well they've done over the past 3, 4, 5 decades or whatever, or I could leave my money in the bank and I'm going backwards after tax and inflation, 1.5% a year. And this is the key thing now. It's not just the level of interest rates at the moment. It's the fact that our central bank and other central banks have stressed we're going to keep interest rates low for a great number of years. So your investor is thinking, well, okay, not only will I get 0.8% this year, maybe next year, the year after, who knows, maybe the year after that also. And so a lot of people have jumped into the market for that reason, and it's become a matter of moment, basically, to buy a house.
Yeah, I've seen some reporting that it looks like there's a lot of emotion for a lot of people at the moment. I mean, I think particularly first home buyers, right? That is totally understandable that emotions come in because there is often that feeling of now or never, and you work really hard to pull that deposit together. But there seems to be emotion from a lot of different corners, and you hear about people bidding 20, 30,000 at least over even the asking price, which might have been quite high to begin with. To me, when there's emotion clearly coming into such an important decision, that's a bit of a red flag. What about for you? What do you make of all that?
Oh, been there, done that a number of times. My first house I bought back in 1987, the prices was rising strongly. Banks were lending money, whereas for many decades they'd been restricted. Rumours were going around about, people would say to me, all the economists at the Reserve Bank are buying houses, etc. I was working at Westpac at the time. And I can still remember the FOMO that gripped me back then. Oh my God, I've got to buy anything. And so I did. I found basically the cheapest place I could afford. I ran up 4 credit cards to their limit and went to the bank and said, hey, here's my 10% deposit. And they said, okay. And so I bought with no deposit back then. So I fully understand, I'm prepared to say, the FOMO feeling. And of course, when it is rampant, people will be bringing into doing now what they were planning to do in 12, 18, 24, 36 months time. So a lot of the strength at the moment we can put down to, well, this, if things were normal and calm, this person would be in the market in 12, 24, 36 months, but they're in the market now. And that's what I guess adds to the whole sort of fervor in the market. You've got vendors, people looking to sell, and they read the stories of the place was valued at 1.1 million and it sold after frenzied bidding at 1.6 million. And so the vendors now are lifting their asking prices, and that's just frustrating the buyers even more. The buyers have repeatedly missed out on places which they love. They've gone through the LIM reports, they've got financing organised, chatted with a builder, all these sort of things. And so people have been doing that and missing out now for a number of months, and they're determined not to miss out again. And so they're leaping in with very strong bids straight away because they're tired of missing out, essentially. And so they just want to secure something there. And of course, one of the key things at the moment is listings, the stock on the market. At the end of December, the number of properties listed in New Zealand was down about 26% from a year earlier, but 73% down from 10 years earlier. The nominal numbers are phenomenal in terms of the decline there. And so with the listings in such short supply, there's this extra scramble going on. And when vendors look at putting their property on the market, they go, well, hang on, we've got to buy before we sell, because if we sell when we know we can easily, but then are we going to be able to buy on the other side? It spirals in on itself. And that's what we're in at the moment, on sort of an upward spiral in the prices, in the tensions. It's all still feeding upon itself.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of the things that you said that, pushed those prices up last year, I mean, obviously last year was a weird one on many different levels. And we've still got some of those factors sticking around, but a lot of the economic stimulus that kept things propped up is slowly being pulled back. And yet the core underlying problem, at least for a lot of analysis, says this is the core underlying problem, is there simply aren't enough houses. So when things have been climbing so high, so fast, I mean, I look at it and I think there must be an end point, but are there any signs of that end point or even a leveling off?
Okay, yeah, there eventually will be an end point, and it depends what a person means by end point. So let's clarify that right from the start. I'm not expecting house prices to fall. In New Zealand, we generally only have average house prices falling when we are physically in a recession, and we were only briefly early last year, and house prices fell 3% over April and May, 2-month period. I'm not seeing that as likely coming forward. And also the falls in house prices tend to come after we have had a period of interest rates rising, and then getting to the crunch level. Well, there's nothing remotely like that happening. So not at all here talking about house prices falling. But there are some things in play which say that the rate of increase in house prices is going to slow down. Not tremendously slow down, but one of the key factors will be the LVRs, the loan to value ratios, or I like to talk in terms of minimum deposits. So from the end of April last year, the Reserve Bank made its announcement that for 12 months from May 1, there would be no minimum deposits, LVRs. Banks started lobbying the Reserve Bank, I'm guessing about September, October last year, saying, have you seen what's happening out there? Every man and his dog is buying a house. Maybe you want to bring the LVRs back in earlier than you were thinking. And the Reserve Bank reluctantly said, okay, we'll do a review. The banks didn't wait. They've already basically put back in place the 20% minimum deposit requirements there. ANZ announced 30% minimum deposit for investors. People expect, okay, the LVRs officially, well, they're obviously coming back March 1, and people are going with encouragement from folk like myself. Maybe it's going to be a 40% minimum deposit for investors. I give that an 80% chance that the Reserve Bank will say 40% minimum deposit. And so one reason for the frenzy at the moment, people are looking to make a purchase and come in under the minimum deposit sort of radar there. Once it's in place, then I expect we'll get a bit of a step back in the market. So that's the first thing. The LVRs will come back in place. Second thing, as each month goes by this year, we're going to get closer to the international borders reopening. And while that's going to be beneficial overall to the New Zealand economy, tourists eventually coming in over 2022, you and I will start to think, okay, maybe I will be able to get across to the GC with a bubble, maybe across to Paris early next year. We'll start reallocating our money. At the moment we've decided I can't travel, I'll buy a house and then I'll travel down the track. Well, once we can see travel as an opportunity again, we'll go back to, I'm going to save for travel and I'm going to give up buying a house. I'll look at that issue again in 3 to 5 years' time. So that also will be out there. I expect the government will make some noises around trying to accelerate the growth in house supply, but that's a long-term thing. Quite frankly, it's not going to make much of a difference, I'd suggest, this year. But yeah, some of those elements will start to slow the market down this year. But I think come the end of the year, as pretty much all the other forecasters out there have been saying, you're probably still looking at house prices rising at an annual pace come the end of 2021, maybe around 10% or so. It'll be a slowing back from the frenzy.
Interesting. And just to quickly clarify for anyone who's listening, LVRs, of course, when we talk about those, that's how much deposit the bank wants you to have. So if an investor was asked to have 40% of the house price as the deposit, that would be really interesting. I think that would be a move that would have an impact, as you say. I have seen some analysis from some quarters, not yourself, but other analysts around, saying that if the government brought in all of its plans to build lots of houses, that it could be an oversupply and that could crash the market, and it could be terrible, of course, for those who already own. So you don't see that coming.
Everybody making that prediction has been wrong for decades, that there's a crash, there's something nasty coming along. No, look, fundamentally in New Zealand, we haven't built enough affordable houses. Now, people got to listen to what I said just there. I didn't say enough houses all up. You can look at the occupancy rate for houses in New Zealand. And back in 1991, I think the census as I started at, in 1991, the occupation rate for houses in New Zealand was 2.78 people per house. In the most recent census, 2018, it was 2.82. In other words, since 1991, there has basically been exactly the same growth in the number of houses as in the number of people, the percentage-wise. But there is a shortage of affordable accommodation. And what I mean there is that up until the middle of the 1990s, maybe 25% of the houses being built around New Zealand were in the lowest price bracket, the lowest 25% of the price range in a local area. But for some reason, since the 1990s, only about 5% of houses have been in that price range. So that's really where the shortage lies. And the worst shortage, of course, as we can see by the state house waiting lists, is in the, I guess, the social housing for those people there. And unfortunately, I think the situation will get worse. Now, for the government, yep, they've already made some good moves, preventing councils in 6 locations around the country from restricting up to 6-story buildings in particular areas in their cities, etc. House supply is going to grow, but there's a shortage of land at the moment. The FOMO that manifests itself in people just buying whatever's on the market has led to a seizing up, a securing in place subdivisions for future developments, people buying sections, then going out looking for a builder, etc. So for at the moment, there's a shortage of land, and it's going to take councils a while to get the subdivision train sort of rolling again over the next few years. And of course, there's a shortage of builders, carpenters, electricians, tradespeople generally. And unless the government is going to open up the borders, even when the borders are open, ease the migration criteria so 50,000 builders can come in from overseas, it's very hard to see massive growth in house supply in the future. It will grow, but it's not going to be to the extent of, the big oversupply situation we had for a while in the second half of the 1970s.
Yeah, I've got to say, I mean, obviously some people are making hay out of the housing situation, and good for them, that's great. But obviously I get a lot of correspondence from first home buyers who feel very worried and worried that they'll ever manage to get in there. And I know it's always hard to buy a first home, but of course, for many, it feels like it's harder now. So I'd love to know from the stats that you keep an eye on, is it harder now? And do you ever worry about the fairness of the current housing system?
Well, in terms of, first of all, first-home buyers making a purchase, yeah, the only real insight we have there comes from the data from CoreLogic. And their numbers, I think they start about 2007, maybe it's a little bit earlier. On average, 21% of purchases are by first-home buyers. And in the December quarter of last year, that was 23%. September quarter was 25%. So that just sort of reinforces what I said. Coming out of lockdown, it was the first-home buyers who jumped into the market in greater numbers than we ever thought. looking for the purchase opportunity. When I took out that first mortgage, my purchase back in 1987, my interest rate was 18.5%. And I felt so lucky when eventually it dropped down to 15.5%. And so I look aghast at people borrowing at the moment at 2.29%. What do you have to complain about? Well, what you got to complain about is that one of the reasons we've seen a permanent repricing of the housing stock in New Zealand and overseas is because of a permanent structural decline in the average level of interest rates. And it changes the dynamic. We felt pain back then in the 80s, 90s, 2000s because of much higher interest rates. Now the interest rates are lower, but the house prices have gone up in order, I guess, like I say, to reflect that. One of the key changes I think going forward is going to be this. This is a bit of a warning for somebody looking at their mortgage over the next few years. Ever since about 1979 in New Zealand, whatever your first mortgage rate was, your average rate for your mortgage turned out to be lower than that because the interest rates were falling over time. Nobody borrowing now at 2.29, 2.49 or 99% is going to have their average mortgage rate for the next 5, 10, 30 years lower than what they're paying at the moment. So just keep a wee eye on that one when you're looking at the debt that you're taking on. In my opinion, it is harder for young people to buy a place these days because physically there simply aren't as many affordable places out there. That is changing. We can look at, say, the average size of houses getting built. Back in 1972, I think it was, the earliest data, the average size of a new dwelling consented was 105 square metres. I think we finished that decade around about 130. We peaked at 200 square metres in about 2014, and now we're down to about 158 square metres for the average house, townhouse, etc., getting built over the past year. So things are moving a bit more in their favour, but it's going to be a slow grind over time.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously a lot of these things are structural and they're big issues and they might take years, especially if we're talking housing supply, they might take years to fix. But if you had the government's ear and you were pretty confident they were listening, is there one major thing that you would say you should consider this as a change to the housing market?
Yeah, remove the planning rules. The key difference here, I've already mentioned one of the factors contributing to higher house prices, or the ratio of house prices to income now, a structural decline in interest rates. I've been running through lists for about 12 or 14 years of things that have permanently changed, migration flows, more people in the workforce, etc. A key one, of course, is the cost of land. There's not so much available. And if you go back to about 1992, I think is my starting point on this one, and you look at the ratio of the average section cost to the average dwelling consent value, the place that gets built on the section, that was about 40%. So if the house was valued, the price of the construction was $100,000, the section was $40,000. Now, on average in the past year, that's been about 80%. So if, making up the numbers, the construction cost was 100,000. Now the section cost 80,000. So that's a key structural difference. In Auckland, it's gone from 55% to 130% in terms of those land prices. So the big change, if the government was really serious, I think, would be to make a heck of a lot more land available. But again, they'd have to accompany that by letting in a lot more builders from overseas, because so many people left the sector after the big decline in house construction to multi-decade lows following the global financial crisis. People often think in terms of, okay, can we slam the investors? Big problem. There's massive demand for rental accommodation in New Zealand now. And if you slam the investors with some new costs or whatever, the rents will go up. That is what has happened in the past year and the past few years as a result of decreased returns to the investors. I think that horse has bolted. And so I think the government more has to focus on land availability. Not going to be quite so good if you're sitting there in some lovely suburb in Wellington, Auckland, or wherever, and all of a sudden with no restraint, there's a 15-story building can go next door. But that's the sort of thing that could make a difference.
Yeah. Oh, hey, it's really interesting. Thank you so much for your insight. That's independent economist Tony Alexander. Now, you might have questions about this, obviously a big topic, or anything else to do with money, really. If you do, send it through to me. We'll try to do a future podcast on that. You can find me on Facebook, Francis Cook Journalist, Twitter, Francis Cook, Instagram, Francis Cook NZ. Just pick your favorite, send me your questions. Can't always get back to everyone individually, but I do try to make sure that the podcast episodes reflect what you're asking me about. Don't forget to subscribe to Cooking the Books everywhere you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if this episode was helpful, then tell a friend. We can all learn more about money together. Until next time, have a great day.